It's kind of annoying how the most beautiful blue sky, sunny days, the ones where you want to spend all of your time outside just soaking it all in, are also so challenging from a photography and videography perspective. No diffusion from clouds, so you've just got this really, really harsh sunlight. Also, if you're shooting upwards at all, if you're gonna get any sky in your shot, you've got no interest in the background because you don't have like nice big fluffy clouds or any texture or anything like that. It kind of reminds me of like healthy food too, like the least healthy foods are the tastiest ones and vice versa, the healthiest foods are not as tasty. Am I alone in that? Is that just the way that I'm thinking? Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about today. The reason that the blue cloudless skies are so on my mind today are specifically because over the last couple of weeks I've been shooting a lot of time lapses, something that I used to do a lot of but kind of got out of the habit of because of the daunting task of shooting interval photos and having to compile them and then make them into a sequence. I just really didn't like that process a lot, and something has happened recently. I got a new feature on my new cameras that's allowed me to do it in a way that's a lot easier, and so I've been playing around with that a lot more. But I must admit, I'm definitely out of practice when it comes to shooting really nice time lapses. They're a really hard thing to do, to get the conditions just right, to get the settings just right, and you kind of don't know whether you nailed it until after it's done, and they take a lot of time. So I've been doing a lot more practicing, and I kind of wanted to talk about that process and this new feature and kind of why it's got me excited about time lapses again. So what is this new time-lapse feature that's made me all of a sudden want to shoot time lapses again? Well, it's not the hugest, most mind-blowing feature update. It's something that was already kind of in Sony cameras, but they've just given it a little bit of a tweak, and it was something that I've been asking for a long time. And that is in the S&Q mode, so slow and quick mode, they allow you to shoot in a certain frames per second and then play back in a different one. So you can use this for slow motion if you want. You can shoot in 120 frames per second and slow it down to 24, or 60 and slow it down to 24, depending on what your camera is. Or you can go the other way and you can shoot at a slower frames per second and speed it up to 24 frames per second. And that is essentially shooting a time lapse, but without the annoyance of having to shoot in an interval mode where you're shooting photos and then you have to take those afterwards and pull them into Lightroom and do all your editing that you want. There was just this huge process around creating a time lapse. I kind of stopped shooting time lapses specifically because I didn't want to have to go through that whole process. Now with the S&Q mode, you would shoot at, let's say, 1 frame per second, and you would play it back at 24. And when you were done shooting the time lapse, you could watch it back on the back of the camera. But the problem with that is that it maxed out at a 1 second interval. And what they've done with this new time-lapse mode, so when you go into S&Q on either the A1 Mark II or the A9 Mark III, and I assume that they'll add this to other cameras either in firmware updates or when new cameras come out, what they've done is they've added it so that when you go into S&Q mode, it gives you an option, either S&Q, the standard, the old-fashioned way, or you can go into something called time-lapse mode. In time-lapse mode, you've got the option to do between 1 and 5 second intervals. So they've given us the option to go beyond the 1 second intervals now up to 5 second intervals, and then you can play it back at whatever speed you want it to, which is so handy for me because sometimes things just aren't moving fast enough that a 1 second interval makes sense, but I didn't want to shoot the photo. So there was this kind of gap between what I could do before in S&Q and what I would have to move over to a photo interval mode. So now they've kind of bridged that gap, but there are still some limitations to what you can do in this new S&Q time-lapse mode. The first limitation is that you're still maxed out at a shutter speed of 1 second. So if you wanted to get some really like creamy, smooth water, or you wanted to really blur out the clouds and do longer exposures for your shutter speed, speed, even if you're at a 5-second interval, you can still only shoot a 1-second max shutter, which is a bit of a disappointment for me because obviously being able to get the longer intervals means that I want to get longer exposures as well sometimes, and that can be really helpful for, like I said, kind of smoothing out water and that kind of stuff. That being said, when you were in the old S&Q mode, if you were shooting at an interval of 1 second, which was the slowest that you could go for a time lapse, it would literally only refresh the screen every 1 second, and it was so annoying to try and set up your shot and that kind of stuff. So now what they've got is whether you're between 1 or 5 seconds, your screen is still refreshing at whatever your shutter speed is. So if you are doing a slow shutter, it definitely is jittery and blurry and all that kind of stuff when you're trying to set it up. But if you set it up at a bit of a higher shutter speed setting, you can see what you're doing, and then you can put it on whatever actual setting you want for the shot. So it's obviously not perfectly ideal, and some of the time lapses that I've shot so far, I haven't been 100% happy with because I'm kind of limited in those ways, but it definitely bridges the gap between what I had before, which was that 1 second max interval or shoot photo intervals. Because this new mode reduces the hassle of shooting time lapses, I've been finding myself doing it a lot more and playing around with it and having a lot more fun with it. And it's also got me kind of thinking about the way that I approach time lapses. The first consideration for a time lapse is that something needs to be moving. Now, this can be clouds, it could be water, it could be cars, it could be people, any of those kinds of things. But the second consideration is how fast are those things moving? And I like to use clouds in my mind to kind of think about how to set up the time lapse. So for example, if there are clouds that are moving quite quickly, I can probably get away with something like a 2-second interval. However, if the clouds are just barely moving, I'll try and ramp that up to something like a 5-second interval, or if I have to go beyond that, obviously I have to use the photo interval mode, but you can really crank that up and do even longer intervals in which you're compressing a larger amount of time into a shorter video. Now, if we go back to something like cars or people, a 1-second interval will probably be fine because those things are moving pretty quickly to start with. They're already visibly moving even if we were just shooting regular video. And then the third thing that I always think about when it comes to time lapses is the motion blur and the shutter speed that I want to be shooting at. One thing that you can do if you're unsure of what to set your shutter speed at is just follow the 180-degree shutter rule. So typically when we're shooting video, if we're at 24 frames per second, we want to be shooting at 1/48th of a second shutter speed, so twice as fast as the frame rate. So if we just take that and apply it to our time lapses, if we're shooting at a 1-second interval, I would want something around a 1/2 of a second of a shutter speed. 2-second interval would be a 1-second shutter speed. And unfortunately, that's where this new mode that I've been talking about kind of maxes out. So I've been shooting all my 5-second interval time lapses all at 1-second shutter speeds. And you know, it's not how I would want it to be necessarily. It would be nice to be able to crank that up a little bit more, but it is still working to some extent. And the kind of final consideration that is related to that shutter speed is that because I want these really slow shutter speeds to get the motion blur, I definitely want to have ND filters on me to fix my exposure for when I'm cranking that shutter speed to a really slow speed. Otherwise, you're just gonna get a super blown out exposure all the time. Now, the original plan for coming out here to Fort Rod Hill, which is like a open air museum kind of thing, it was an old military fort, was to shoot this lighthouse, shoot a time lapse of it with the clouds moving in the background. And obviously, if there are no clouds, I can't necessarily do that. I was hoping that if I waited long enough, the clouds would move in or something, but we're just getting a pure blue sky kind of day. Now, that being said, there are some clouds over that way, over on top of the Olympic Mountains. So once I do get kicked out of here, I'll probably make my way over to another beach, see if I can find some kind of a composition to get a shot of that, to get a time lapse of the clouds moving over the mountains, and hopefully that turns out. And I really want to know, is this something that you're excited about, this feature in Sony cameras, whether it's on one one of the cameras that you have, or whether it might be an update or something like that. Is it something that you might find useful? And do you shoot time lapses? Am I the only one who likes time lapses? You don't see a whole lot of time lapses these days. So how many times can I say time lapses in one video? Thanks so much for watching, for coming on a little photo adventure with me. Let me know if you have any questions down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.